At the end of the Second World War, the fate of Adolf Hitler became one of the greatest enigmas of the 20th century. While the Allies celebrated the fall of the Third Reich, scattered rumors and testimonies began to circulate about a possible escape of the Nazi leader. Military documents, bank records and escape routes suggest that before the collapse of Berlin, evacuation plans for key figures of the regime had already been devised. Operations with submarines, networks of front companies, and agreements with neutral countries pointed to South America as the final destination of several high-ranking officials. In this network, the figure of Martin Bormann played a central role, ensuring the transfer of funds and the establishment of safe havens. The Argentine coasts, with submarine landings such as the U-530 and the U-977, and the construction of ranches in remote places such as Bariloche, fueled decades of investigations. Was the Berlin bunker his final abode, or did he manage to escape and live in anonymity in distant lands? The royal rise of Nazism. In October of 1942, the Reich's military power was at its highest point. The German forces dominated territories that stretched from the Arctic seas of northern Norway to the deserts of North Africa, and from the French Atlantic coast to the Volga River in the heart of the Soviet Union. In Africa, the Expeditionary Corps of Erwin Rommel was prepared to seize the Suez Canal, considered the most valuable strategic route of the British Empire. On the Eastern Front, the Sixth Army under the command of Friedrich Paulus was advancing with ferocity inside Stalingrad, waging an intense street-by-street struggle. Conquering the canal and Stalingrad meant opening the way to control the oil fields of the Caucasus and the Middle East, ensuring energy resources for decades. In the Atlantic, German submarines maintained constant pressure on Allied convoys. From bases on the French Atlantic coast, Karl Dönitz's fleet attacked in coordinated groups, intercepting the supply routes that connected America with Europe. Numerous ships loaded with fuel, weapons and food bound for Great Britain were sunk without respite. The British government admitted that the survival of the country depended on those maritime routes. Winston Churchill even stated that the only thing that deeply troubled him was the threat of the U-boats. Since early 1940, the code-breaking team at Bletchley Park had been working tirelessly to break the codes of the Enigma machine used by the German Navy. Although they managed to decipher messages and obtain crucial intelligence, in February of 1942, the Germans changed the Enigma settings, which caused the British to lose the ability to anticipate submarine movements. This change, named Shark by the cryptanalysts, returned to Dönitz a dangerous advantage at sea. At the end of October of 1942, a convoy identified as SC-107 departed from New York toward Great Britain. It carried 42 ships filled with vital supplies, escorted by a Canadian group composed of 5 vessels, 1 destroyer and 4 corvettes. The route crossed the area known as the Black Pit, a stretch of the mid-Atlantic beyond the reach of Allied air coverage. In that zone, 13 German submarines of the Weilchen group awaited, ready to attack under the cover of darkness. During the night of the 2nd of November, 2 U-boats managed to break through the convoy's defences and approach at close range. The U-402, under the command of Baron Siegfried von Forstner, launched a volley of torpedoes from barely 400 meters away. One of the projectiles struck the ship Empire Sunrise, leaving it severely damaged. Another submarine, the U-84 under the command of Horst Uphoff, sank the freighter shortly afterward. In that same raid, the U-522 of Herbert Schneider destroyed 4 additional ships. At dawn, 8 merchant vessels had been sunk and 2 others rendered unusable. During the following day, the escorts performed evasive maneuvers, changing course whenever the fog or storms gave them a chance to escape. However, by nightfall on the 3rd of November, the U-89 of Dietrich Lohmann managed to infiltrate the center of the convoy. It fired 5 torpedoes, hitting 2 ships, among them the Jaipur, the flagship loaded with munitions. Shortly afterward, the U-132 under the command of Ernst Vogelsang launched another series of torpedoes against the starboard flank, sinking 3 vessels. One of them exploded with such violence that the shockwave was felt several kilometers away, even damaging submarines submerged at 200 feet of depth. The U-132 disappeared with its entire crew after that detonation. On the 5th of November, a B-24 Liberator bomber from the 120th Squadron of the Royal Air Force located the convoy, allowing for the arrival of naval reinforcements from Iceland. Under aerial attack, the U-89 was damaged, and the Weilchen group was forced to disperse. The outcome was devastating. 15 merchant ships sunk and 4 seriously damaged, adding up to more than 100,000 tons of losses for the Allies. During November of 1942, the tonnage sunk by submarines surpassed 730,000 tons. Throughout the entire year of 1942, the total reached 6.5 million tons, equivalent to 1,661 ships. The Allies destroyed 87 submarines, but Germany built 238 new units, raising Dönitz's fleet from 91 to 212 vessels. The supply of oil and raw materials was the driving force of the Nazi war machine. Since the 1930s, Germany had understood that fuel was as strategic as soldiers. The lack of reserves forced the Reich to control territories with oil wells and maritime routes to import resources. Hence the importance of the campaigns in the Caucasus and the Middle East, as well as the synthetic fuel plants that transformed coal into gasoline. German industries, especially those of steel and armaments, operated within a mixed economic system that combined private companies with state control. Large consortia such as IG Farben and Krupp obtained million-dollar contracts to produce weapons, tanks and airplanes. In return, they supported the regime with technology, capital and slave labor from concentration camps. This war in Europe generated extraordinary profits for the business groups associated with the Reich. The control of transportation and communications was equally vital. Railways, ports and roads operated to supply the front with soldiers, munitions and food. The occupied cities were plundered of all kinds of goods, from industrial machinery to harvests. The gold from the central banks of the conquered countries was confiscated and sent to Berlin, then transferred to accounts in Switzerland, Spain and Portugal to finance the purchase of raw materials on the international market. At the same time, the Allied resistance attempted to cut off this flow with strategic bombings. Armament factories and refineries were priority targets for the Royal Air Force and the United States aviation. Despite these attacks, in 1942 German production continued to grow, fueled by forced labor and the plundering of the occupied territories. The situation in the Atlantic remained critical for the Allies. Each ship sunk meant fewer tanks, fewer airplanes and less food to sustain the fight. The escorts faced torpedoes, naval mines and the ambushes of the U-boats. A mistake in formation or a delay could cost several ships in minutes. The winter of 1942 represented a double challenge: to keep the routes open and to prepare the upcoming Allied offensive in North Africa and Europe. The British and American commands knew that the only way to defeat Hitler was to ensure a continuous flow of supplies across the Atlantic, despite the constant threat of the submarines. The pressure in Bletchley Park was at its peak. The cryptanalysts worked day and night to once again decipher the enigma codes. Each intercepted message meant saving thousands of lives at sea. With the support of mathematicians, engineers and the first electromechanical machines, they achieved progress that gradually tipped the balance, but in November of 1942, the U-boats still held the advantage. In this scenario of total war, the Nazi leaders were convinced that dominating the Atlantic would secure victory. For Dönitz, sinking millions of tons of ships meant strangling Great Britain until it was forced to surrender. For Hitler, controlling the oil of the Caucasus and the supply routes was equivalent to sustaining his empire for decades. Each decision was made with the certainty that speed and brutality were the most effective weapons. The defeats that changed the Nazi course. By the end of 1942, the German offensive in North Africa began to weaken. Marshal Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, had advanced into Egypt with the intention of seizing the Suez Canal. However, the 8th British Army, under the command of Bernard Montgomery, mounted a firm defence along the El Alamein lines. By the end of October, thousands of soldiers and hundreds of tanks clashed in a decisive battle. For nearly 2 weeks, Rommel's troops were pushed back toward Libya. Fuel and ammunition reserves were rapidly dwindling, while supply convoys were attacked from both the air and the sea. On the 17th of November, the Afrika Korps began an organized retreat, leaving behind equipment and strategic positions. At the same time, on the Eastern Front, the German army was going through its most critical moment. The 6th Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, had penetrated Stalingrad in September. What had seemed like a sure victory turned into a desperate urban struggle. The Soviet forces, led by Georgy Zhukov, defended each building as a fortress. By mid-November, Operation Uranus changed the entire outlook. With a massive counter-offensive, the Soviets surrounded more than 250,000 German and Allied troops. The encirclement cut off supply routes, trapping entire divisions in conditions of extreme cold and hunger. From his headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler ordered Paulus to resist at all costs. Hermann Göring promised to sustain the troops with an airlift of 500 tons per day, but the planes barely managed to deliver a fraction of what was needed. Thousands of soldiers died each day from freezing or starvation. Stalingrad was shaping up to be the first major strategic defeat of the Reich. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the situation was becoming more complicated. Operation Torch, launched on the 8th of November of 1942, brought American and British troops to land in Morocco and Algeria. Within a few weeks, the Axis forces were cornered between the Allied units advancing from the west and the British pressing from Egypt. Rommel, sick and exhausted, requested reinforcements that never arrived. By the end of December, the Afrika Korps was retreating toward Tunisia. The pressure on Germany was increasing on all fronts. Alan Dulles, head of the Office of Strategic Services in Switzerland, gathered information on the internal situation of the Reich. Through contacts with diplomats, businessmen and discontented officers, he detected factions seeking to negotiate a way out. These conversations, although informal, revealed the growing fear among Nazi leaders of a total defeat. Allied bombings on industrial cities intensified at the end of 1942. The Royal Air Force struck Essen, Hamburg and Kassel, destroying factories and homes. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, reorganized production to maintain the supply of weapons, tanks and airplanes. He resorted to the massive use of forced labor from concentration camps. Despite the attacks, German production remained active, though with greater difficulties in obtaining raw materials. The fall of Stalingrad became imminent in December. Soviet troops sealed the encirclement and stopped every rescue attempt. Marshal von Manstein, sent to aid Paulus, came to less than 50 kilometers from the city, but failed to break enemy lines. On the 23rd of January of 1943, the divisions of the Afrika Korps lost Tripoli, and Rommel had to regroup in Tunisia. Germany was facing simultaneous defeats on two vital fronts. In this context, Martin Bormann accelerated his secret operations. He oversaw the creation of front companies to transfer capital abroad. In addition, he coordinated with Swiss and Spanish bankers to hide funds in secret accounts. He promoted the forgery of documents and the creation of false identities for high-ranking officials who were preparing escape routes. These actions were carried out discreetly, even without the knowledge of other party leaders. In Berlin, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense. Hitler blamed his generals for the setbacks but maintained his strategy. He demanded impossible offensives and punished any proposal for retreat. Goebbels, aware of public discouragement, launched an intense propaganda campaign to sustain morale. He used films, speeches and radio broadcasts to minimize the failures. Meanwhile, the entry of the United States into the war after Pearl Harbor had shifted the industrial balance. By the end of 1942, US military production far exceeded that of Germany. Each month, more troops, tanks and airplanes crossed the Atlantic to reinforce the British. In Stalingrad, the winter deepened the tragedy. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero, freezing weapons and equipment. The soldiers suffered from a lack of adequate clothing and a shortage of food. Supplies were running out, and episodes of cannibalism emerged among those under siege. On the 27th of January, Soviet forces rejected the last offer of surrender and continued advancing. The defeat at El Alamein and the situation in Tunisia confirmed that North Africa was lost. In February of 1943, Rommel was evacuated for health reasons, and command passed to Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. The Allies were advancing toward Tunisia, ready to leap to Sicily. At the same time, the Soviet offensive liberated vast areas on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad fell on the 2nd of February of 1943, with the surrender of Paulus and more than 90,000 prisoners. This capitulation struck German morale hard. Hitler, furious, dismissed several generals and assumed direct control of key operations. Meanwhile, Bormann's secret operations continued. Contacts were established with Argentine companies to transfer looted funds and goods. Ships began transporting documents, gold bars and works of art to safe ports. In barely 3 months, Germany lost Africa, its eastern offensive came to a halt, and the initiative passed into Allied hands. Bormann's plans to secure resources and escape networks became a strategic priority as the Reich entered its most critical phase. Bormann, the hidden brain of the Reich. Martin Bormann became the most powerful man behind Hitler, controlling access to the Führer and managing the party's most delicate affairs. He was born in Wegeleben in 1901 and joined the Nazi Party in 1927. From his early years, he stood out for his efficiency, his ability to organize complex tasks, and his quiet ambition. With Hitler's rise to power in 1933, Bormann quickly ascended the administrative hierarchies. He soon assumed control of the so-called Adolf Hitler Fund for the German economy, a structure intended to receive enormous sums of money from the Reich's main industries. Companies such as Krupp, Thyssen, IG Farben and Daimler-Benz handed over millions of marks in voluntary contributions to secure their influence. Bormann managed these contributions and invested them in projects that benefited the party and its leaders. Part of those funds was used to build residences, finance propaganda campaigns, and cover the personal expenses of Hitler and his closest circle. In 1936, he was appointed head of the party chancellery. From that position, he consolidated a network of contacts with bankers and European businessmen, initiating discreet financial operations in neutral countries such as Switzerland. Bormann's ability to handle these matters surpassed that of any other Nazi leader. Even figures such as Himmler and Goebbels depended on his decisions to gain access to resources. Hitler trusted him completely, considering him indispensable to the internal functioning of the party. That relationship allowed him to make strategic decisions without direct supervision, becoming the true logistical brain of the Reich. As the war progressed, Bormann reinforced his control over confiscated assets in Europe. Gold, jewels and works of art were transferred to secret depots in Austria and Bavaria. Some pieces were sent through Switzerland and Spain, operations that he coordinated with meticulous care. These riches were seen as a financial reserve to sustain the party, even in the event of defeat. His power within the chancellery grew to unprecedented levels. He controlled the communications that reached Hitler, filtered the information, and decided who could have access to the Führer. Many high-ranking officers feared his influence, as a single word from him was enough to ruin anyone's career. He also oversaw the construction of Hitler's Alpine residence at Berghof, as well as every personal detail of the leader, from his finances to the gifts he received. During 1943, Bormann perfected his internal administration system. He negotiated agreements with Swiss banks for the purchase of strong currencies, such as dollars and pounds sterling, essential for obtaining raw materials and technology in international markets. Part of these currencies was allocated to strategic payments and bribes to foreign officials in order to maintain supply routes despite the Allied blockade. His control was not limited to money. He also oversaw the use of forced labor in weapons factories and mines. The collaborating companies obtained lucrative contracts, while prisoners were exploited under brutal conditions. These operations generated income that fed the party's central fund. Hitler rarely questioned Bormann. Unlike other leaders, he avoided public prominence and focused his power on the absolute control of administration. He had access to every decree, every military order, and every economic decision. He was, in practice, the keeper of the Reich's most important secrets. From 1943 onward, Bormann became essential to the survival of the Nazi leadership. He coordinated meetings with representatives from neutral countries to negotiate supplies in exchange for precious metals. He also evaluated possible refuges in remote areas of South America and in regions of Europe where secret colonies could be established. To reinforce his internal control, he distributed rewards and privileges among the officers who followed his orders. Properties, money, and direct access to the Führer were the incentives with which he ensured the loyalty of the leadership. By the end of 1943, Bormann had consolidated an administrative structure so efficient that it operated almost like a parallel state. While the military fronts began to give way, his network of financial and logistical power remained intact, prepared to sustain the party's plans in the event of collapse. The Nazi theft of treasures in Europe. From the start of the invasions, systematic looting was an essential part of the Nazi strategy. Adolf Hitler ordered that the cultural riches of each occupied country be taken and sent to the Reich. His obsession with art led to thousands of paintings, sculptures and jewels being confiscated from museums, galleries and Jewish homes. In Paris, just weeks after the entry of German troops in 1940, seizures began in private collections such as that of the Rothschild family. Officers of the ERR unit, Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, catalogued and packed the most valuable pieces to send them to depots in Germany. Every conquered city became a target for looting. In Warsaw, Krakow, Amsterdam and Brussels, specialized teams broke into museums and libraries to empty entire shelves. Thousands of rare volumes, medieval manuscripts and liturgical objects were sent to Berlin. The ERR operated with a meticulous system. Each piece was inventoried and classified to be assigned to the personal collections of Nazi leaders or to the planned Führer Museum in Linz, Austria. The Nazis also confiscated coins, jewels, antique furniture and silverware. Jewish homes were emptied while their owners were deported. Everything was loaded onto special trains bound for depots in Bavaria and Austria. Some works were sent to Neuschwanstein Castle, converted into a secret warehouse. Others were hidden in salt mines such as those of Altausay, where thousands of paintings by masters like Vermeer, Rembrandt and Leonardo da Vinci were stored. Martin Bormann oversaw many of these operations through his administrative network. Part of the confiscated art was used to bribe foreign officials or to trade on the European black market. Swiss and French dealers collaborated in the sale of paintings to private collectors willing to pay large sums. Trains loaded with stolen art traveled across Europe with special schedules and escorts. Later documents show that between 1941 and 1943, more than 130 convoys filled with cultural objects left Paris. Each shipment included hundreds of paintings, sculptures and pieces of furniture carefully packed and marked with the Reich's official seals. In France, the Hôtel Majestic and the Musée du Jeu de Paume served as classification centres. Rose Valland, a French curator, risked her life secretly recording the destination of thousands of pieces. Her notes were key after the war in recovering part of the looted heritage. However, a large number of works never returned to their original owners and remained in private collections or disappeared in illegal transactions. In the Netherlands, the looting was also brutal. Works by Flemish masters were taken from museums and sold to German magnates. In Poland, the Nazis seized the national treasure, including the Wawel relics and Leonardo's lady with an ermine. Many of these pieces were moved to eastern Germany to protect them from bombings, although the real objective was to appropriate them permanently. The looting was not limited to Western Europe. In the Soviet Union, German troops emptied museums in Kiev, Minsk and Smolensk. Tons of art and historical objects were sent west before the Red Army could recover them. These pieces, labelled as cultural booty, fed both the personal collections of Hitler, Goering and Bormann and the clandestine market that generated resources for the regime. With the Allied advance in 1944, the Nazis began moving the most important depots toward Austria and Bavaria. Mines such as Altausay were reinforced to withstand bombings. There, works like Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer and Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece were stored, along with sculptures, tapestries and jewels of incalculable value. Depots were also set up in castles such as Chiemsee or in caves in the Bavarian Alps. When Allied troops advanced, many pieces were deliberately destroyed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The logistics of the looting were as complex as those of military operations. Armoured trains, convoys guarded by the SS, and packing experts worked to transport the objects without damage. The ERR kept detailed lists with photographs and descriptions of each piece. Bormann received constant reports on the status of the depots and the destination of the confiscated art. The looting of Jewish homes, known as mobile action, was especially lucrative. In Paris alone, more than 70,000 apartments were emptied between 1942 and 1944. Furniture and valuables were auctioned off by merchants aligned with the regime. Cultural looting was also a propaganda tool. The Nazis presented it as the recovery of Germanic art dispersed throughout Europe. In reality, much of Europe's heritage was destroyed or remained hidden. Many Jewish families never recovered their collections. To this day, thousands of pieces remain missing. As the military fronts collapsed, Bormann and the ERR concentrated efforts on ensuring that the most valuable works remained under Nazi control. Some were transferred on diplomatic flights to Switzerland during the last months of the war. Others were hidden in monasteries and farms to prevent their capture. This cultural treasure, managed with precision, became one of the largest looting operations in contemporary history. The hidden gold that financed the escape. From the earliest conquests in Europe, gold was considered the pillar of Nazi financial power. Every invaded country was methodically plundered, beginning with its central banks. In March of 1938, after the annexation of Austria, the Reichsbank took immediate control of Vienna's gold reserves. Bullion, coins and currencies were loaded onto special trains bound for Berlin. This model was repeated in Belgium, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, Italy and France. In each operation, banking technicians melted down the bullion to erase marks of origin, preventing future claims. The National Bank of Belgium lost more than 200 tons of gold in just a few days. France, after the fall of Paris in June of 1940, handed over more than 800 tons that were transported to Berlin and Vienna. The vaults of every occupied country were emptied. Private jewelry and deposits, especially those belonging to Jewish families, were also confiscated. All these resources were used to finance the war and to feed a secret fund for long-term operations. Switzerland became the nerve center of the transactions. The Swiss National Bank and the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, headquartered in Basel, acted as intermediaries. Since 1939, trains loaded with gold had been crossing the Alps to deposit bullion in Swiss banks, where it was converted into Swiss francs, dollars or pounds sterling. This conversion into strong currencies allowed the Reich to pay for raw materials in neutral markets. Spain and Portugal also played key roles. Through agreements with Francisco Franco and Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, Germany purchased enormous quantities of tungsten, a mineral essential for hardening the steel used in weapons and armor. These payments were made in gold, transported by trains and ships under SS custody. Both countries accepted the bullion as part of their strategy to sustain their economies, without questioning its origin. To erase traces, the confiscated gold was melted into unmarked bars and distributed in banks in Lisbon, Madrid and Zurich, using front companies. Declassified documents reveal that between 1939 and 1945, Germany transferred to Switzerland amounts of gold equivalent to hundreds of millions of current US dollars. Part of that gold came from concentration camps. The SS confiscated jewelry, watches, gold teeth, and valuable objects from prisoners. Everything was melted down and sent in hidden shipments, supervised by the SS Economic and Administrative Office in coordination with the Reichsbank. The metal from the victims ended up in the same accounts that sustained the war machine and the party's secret operations. Nazi gold became a tool of negotiation. It was used to bribe officials, buy weapons and guarantee the flow of food and oil in neutral markets. Diplomats and bankers were rewarded with bullion to secure favors. Each transaction was recorded in hidden ledgers, handled only by men of absolute trust. In 1943, when the defeats at Stalingrad and in Africa began to change the course of the war, the flow of gold to Switzerland intensified. Special convoys transported the remaining reserves from Berlin and Vienna to depots in the Bavarian Alps and in Swiss banks. Some trains traveled disguised as coal shipments to avoid bombings. Franco in Spain received part of this metal to reinforce the reserves of the Bank of Spain. In exchange, the Spanish regime allowed the purchase of raw materials and the passage of agents to Portugal and South America. Portugal, for its part, received bullion in exchange for tungsten and rubber, resources vital to the German arms industry. The connection with South America was consolidated at this stage. Front companies in Argentina, Brazil and Chile received transfers of currencies converted from Swiss gold. With that money, ranches, factories and properties were purchased, which later served as refugees for Nazi leaders. Declassified documents show that between 1943 and 1945, millions of Swiss francs were sent to accounts in Buenos Aires and Montevideo. Gold was also used as a political instrument. Secret payments were ordered to leaders and officials of neutral countries to guarantee silence or collaboration. These operations were carried out through intermediaries, diplomatic pouches, and transfers in European banks. Bullion traveled in cargo planes and submarines, using safe routes controlled by the SS. The Bank for International Settlements played an ambiguous role, processing gold transfers between central banks even in the middle of the war. Germany took advantage of this channel to move gold looted from Belgium and Czechoslovakia as if they were legitimate transactions, laundering large amounts of precious metal. By the end of 1945, enormous reserves of Nazi gold still remained outside Germany. It is estimated that in Switzerland alone, more than 700 tons remained. That gold was the foundation of networks such as Odessa, which helped war criminals escape to South America and the Middle East. The transport of gold was carried out using extreme methods. German submarines transported sealed crates of bullion to ports in Spain and Argentina. Allied reports mention shipments unloaded in Mar del Plata and in Galician ports in 1944. These deliveries were coordinated by SS officers and trusted agents. Part of the gold also financed espionage networks in Latin America. Agents in Buenos Aires, Santiago and Rio de Janeiro received funds to bribe officials, forge documents, and prepare escape routes. The Allies attempted to trace the Nazi gold, but Switzerland's neutrality and the discretion of Iberian banks made any recovery difficult. Later investigations confirmed that Swiss bankers had accepted gold with erased markings, integrating it into their reserves. The Nazi financial plan was clear: to convert looted gold into a network of global economic power. Each ingot represented an investment to ensure the survival of Nazism beyond Europe. This system of accumulation and concealment was the backbone that allowed the financing of escape routes, secret networks, and clandestine operations toward Latin America. Flight of the Eagle, the escape route. As the Reich's fronts collapsed, Martin Bormann activated a plan to secure the escape of the Nazi leadership and the transfer of resources. This project, called Action Feuerland, sought to establish strategic refuges in South America, mainly in Argentina. Bormann had designed it since 1942, but the defeat at Stalingrad and the loss of Africa made it urgent. The strategy included escape routes combined with a massive counterfeiting operation, known as Operation Bernhard. Operation Bernhard, directed by the SS, was the core of these maneuvers. Under the orders of Heinrich Himmler, prisoners with experience in printing and engraving produced counterfeit pound sterling banknotes of such high quality that they were almost undetectable. Millions of these pounds circulated in black markets, used to pay for raw materials, bribes and contacts in neutral countries. Part of those funds supported the establishment of support networks in South America. Argentina became the key destination of the operation. Since 1943, Bormann had established links with Ludwig Freude, an Argentine businessman with access to Juan Domingo Perón. Through this contact, agreements were made to guarantee refuge to Nazi leaders who arrived with capital, technology, or strategic information. These agreements included the purchase of ranches in Patagonia and projects in the Bariloche region. For transportation, maritime routes were defined from ports in northern Spain and the French coast. Submarines such as the U-530 and the U-233 were outfitted to transport shipments of documents, money and valuable items to Mar del Plata. The counterfeiting also extended to US dollars. These banknotes circulated in markets in Lisbon and Istanbul, used to obtain passage on neutral ships and to pay intermediaries. The SS set up mobile printing presses in concentration camps and occupied cities, where passports and nationality certificates from Latin America countries were produced, facilitating travel without arousing suspicion. To reinforce logistics on the American continent, investments in Argentina and Paraguay were organized through companies importing machinery and chemical products. These firms acted as covers for the support networks. In parallel, Chile and Brazil were included in the plan. In southern Chile, German colonies such as those in Valdivia and Osorno offered a safe environment. In Brazil, some companies managed to invest in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, despite growing Allied pressure. The extraction of key individuals was the most delicate part. Priority was given to the departure of SS leaders, scientists and technicians. The routes combined flights to Spain, sailings on neutral ships with stopovers in Africa, and connections with submarines bound for South America. Luftwaffe pilots, such as Hans-Ulrich Rudel, took part in reconnaissance missions to validate these itineraries. Coordination remained in the hands of a small core group, using codes and encrypted messages sent to embassies in neutral countries. In 1944, after the Allied landing in Normandy, the Flight of the Eagle plan entered its operational phase. Submarines left Kiel and Hamburg with strategic cargo, while German engineers in Buenos Aires prepared improvised airstrips for emergency flights. Each operation required forged documents, contacts in customs, and bribes calculated in detail. Operation Bernhard made it possible to store large amounts of counterfeit money in Argentina and Uruguay, intended for bribes, property purchases, and industrial projects. Many of these investments materialized in agricultural companies and shipping firms. Flight of the Eagle was the culmination of years of logistical and financial preparation. Every banknote, every submarine, and every forged passport formed part of a structure designed to ensure the survival of the Nazi corps, even before the collapse of Berlin. Operation Hunt for Leaders. In the spring of 1944, as the Allies advanced through Europe, a new priority emerged: to capture Nazi leaders and secure the seizure of military secrets and advanced technology. London and Washington organized intelligence units with specialized commandos operating behind enemy lines. Among these groups stood out the 30 Commando Unit, designed to seize sensitive documents before the Germans could destroy them. Ian Fleming, then a British naval intelligence officer and future creator of James Bond, was one of the minds behind this unit. These forces carried out rapid raids in recently liberated cities to confiscate party archives, communication codes, and experimental prototypes. They also tracked lists of SS and Gestapo personnel in order to follow the trail of high-ranking officers. The findings were sent immediately to intelligence centers in London. The recovered material included maps, bank records, weapons inventories, and data on secret experiments. As the Allies advanced toward Germany, chaos in the Nazi ranks grew. Reich officers tried to destroy evidence or flee toward Bavaria, Austria, and Italy. These routes connected with refugees in monasteries, farms, and the homes of Nazi sympathizers. Some leaders exchanged their uniforms for civilian clothes, others used forged documents prepared in advance. The Allies understood that every day was crucial. British and American commandos accompanied combat troops to secure files at the moment of the German retreat. In Normandy, after the June landing, intelligence depots with information on Nazi networks in Latin America and neutral countries were seized. By the end of 1944, the United States Office of Strategic Services sent agents to Switzerland and Spain to trace the party's financial channels. Intercepted reports showed transfers of money and bullion to Swiss banks, indicating systematic preparation for escape operations. Alan Dulles, head of the OSS in Bern, established contacts with figures close to the Nazi regime who sought to negotiate their safety in exchange for information. Inside Germany, internal resistance to Nazism began to gain strength. Some Wehrmacht officers, aware of the inevitable outcome, attempted contacts with the Allies. However, the Gestapo and the SS maintained strict control, and Bormann reinforced the protection of the leadership. Tunnels, bunkers, and evacuation routes were built, connecting Berlin with Bavaria and Austria. With the liberation of France, the pressure on the top Nazi officials increased. In Paris, the Allies captured Gestapo and Abwehr files detailing espionage networks in Europe and Latin America. They also found lists of ships departing from Marseille and Bordeaux with suspicious cargoes. The advance through Belgium and the Netherlands allowed more documents to be secured. British T-Force commandos captured weapons factories and Luftwaffe offices to prevent technology from falling into Soviet hands. In several operations, depots with gold, artworks, and encrypted documents were discovered. The capture of officers such as Hermann Fegelein and Karl Wolff provided crucial information on escape routes. Armored convoys prepared to transport leaders to Switzerland were confirmed. At the same time, submarine movements toward the South Atlantic raised suspicions about possible maritime escape routes. The OSS and MI6 tracked these activities in Europe, following the so-called rat lines, escape routes organized by Nazi sympathizers with the help of clerics and officials from neutral countries. From Italian ports, ships departed for Latin America, carrying fugitives and valuable cargo. In Rome, contacts linked to the Vatican facilitated Red Cross passports for former SS officers. The trackers documented how these networks extended into Spain, Portugal, and North Africa before crossing the Atlantic. Allied agents intercepted encrypted messages mentioning gold and people with false identities, although the size of the network made it nearly impossible to close all exits. With the end of the war, the hunt for Nazis became a global operation. Figures such as Simon Wiesenthal and Jewish groups began tracking down war criminals to bring them to justice. The Allies compiled blacklists with the names of the most wanted, while clandestine organizations such as Odessa began moving resources to protect the fugitives. Special operations continued for months after the fall of Berlin, pursuing officers in Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. The conflict between Allied intelligence and the escape networks became a race against time that would define the immediate post-war period. From the bunker to the sky, the secret escape. By the end of April of 1945, Berlin was under total siege. Soviet forces advanced from the east, while Allied troops pressed from the west. Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler and his closest circle faced the collapse of the Reich. Martin Bormann and Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, took control of the final operations, organizing the evacuation of the most sensitive archives and planning escape routes for the leadership. The last days were marked by tension and chaos. In the underground tunnels connecting the Chancellery with subway stations and shelters, documents, gold bullion and counterfeit banknotes from Operation Bernhard were stored. Communications with the outside were nearly impossible, but Bormann maintained contact with officers in northern Germany to coordinate secret flights and convoys to the south. Hitler showed clear signs of deterioration, with tremors and bursts of anger. In meetings with his generals, he rejected any surrender. For Bormann, the priority was to guarantee escape. Müller devised a plan that included the use of doubles for Hitler and Eva Braun, trained to replicate their appearance and gestures. The goal was to create a convincing scene in the Chancellery Garden to confuse the Soviets. On the 30th of April, as Soviet artillery fell on the center of Berlin, the simulation was activated. 2 bodies were prepared and burned in the courtyard. Witnesses such as Otto Günsche and Heinz Linger claimed to have seen the bodies in flames, but the remains found were unrecognizable fragments, which opened the possibility of a real escape. While the staging was carried out, Hitler and Eva Braun prepared to leave the bunker. They dressed in civilian clothes and carried forged documents identifying them as low-ranking officers. The exit was made through tunnels connecting to an improvised airstrip on the outskirts of Berlin. There, they were met by a Junkers Ju-52 aircraft from the secret KG-200 unit, specialized in covert missions. The escape was coordinated in detail. SS officers secured the perimeter, while a small convoy distracted Soviet forces in another sector. The plane took off at dawn, bound for northern Germany. The first stop was in Travemünde, where it refueled and the flight plans towards southern Europe were reviewed. Declassified documents decades later mention this takeoff as part of an operation directly supervised by Bormann. Meanwhile, Müller erased traces inside the bunker. Documents on financial movements and lists of escape routes were destroyed. False radio messages were also sent to confuse the Allies. When the Soviets took the Chancellery, they found contradictory reports that fueled doubts about Hitler's fate. After the stop in Travemünde, the plane flew south, skirting Allied-controlled airspace. The second stop was at an airstrip near Reus, Spain. Agents linked to Franco's regime provided fuel and logistics. Spain, with its flexible neutrality, was a key point in the escape routes. From Reus, the Ju-52 flew to the Canary Islands, where submarines from Operation Seawolf awaited to transport secret cargo and personnel to South America. Allied reports confirmed unusual U-boat movements in that area in May of 1945, supporting the hypothesis of an organized escape. During the flight, Hitler remained hidden in an adapted section of the plane alongside Eva Braun and a small group of doctors, aides and security personnel. Each leg was calculated to avoid interceptions. The pilots of KG-200 knew clandestine routes and used false radio codes to go unnoticed. As the plane advanced, in Berlin the Soviets announced that Hitler had died in the bunker. The lack of verifiable remains led the Allies to investigate contradictory testimonies. Some prisoners claimed to have seen Hitler in an armored convoy. Others spoke of flights to Spain. The coordination between the aerial escape and maritime movements was crucial. Submarines such as the U-530 and the U-977 traveled to Argentina and surrendered months after the end of the war, reinforcing the theory that Nazi leaders used those routes. Documents in Argentine archives mention communications between German officers and local authorities to organize the arrival of special cargo. In the final hours in Berlin, Bormann and Müller continued moving funds to Switzerland and Spain. Gold and currencies were transported by train to Austria to hide them in mines and depots, securing resources for the escape network in South America. The flight to the Canary Islands lasted several hours under maximum tension. The pilots avoided known routes and flew at low altitude to evade radar. Once in the archipelago, Hitler and his group changed transportation. Some accounts speak of a ship bound for South America, others of a direct connection with U-boats equipped to transport passengers and valuable cargo. The double hypothesis was supported by Soviet witnesses who described charred bodies that were impossible to identify. Later studies concluded that the dental remains attributed to Hitler did not match the dental records, reinforcing the theory of an escape. The Allies, although they officially accepted the bunker version, continued investigating. The OSS collected reports of sightings in Spain, Morocco, and Argentina. Some were dismissed, but the pattern of airplane and submarine movements was never fully clarified. The secret flight to southern Europe marked the beginning of the last phase of Bormann's plan. From there, the fugitives could travel to South America using the infrastructure prepared years in advance. Argentina, with its isolated ranches and an organized German community, offered a safe refuge. Patagonia, with its lakes and mountains, was the perfect setting to remain hidden for decades. The story of the last days in Berlin, with the simulated death and the aerial escape, remains one of the most enigmatic episodes of the war. Every document and every testimony point to the Nazi leadership having designed a meticulous exit, backed by maritime routes, international contacts, and a financial logistics network impossible to improvise. Secret course: U-boats in South America. On the 10th of July of 1945, the naval base at Mar del Plata was surprised by the appearance of the U-530. The crew surrendered without resistance, but the full contents of the submarine were never disclosed. A month later, on the 17th of August, the U-977 arrived at the same base after a voyage of more than 100 days. The consecutive arrival of these two vessels sparked rumors about the possible evacuation of Nazi leaders and valuable cargo to Argentine coasts before their official surrenders. Reports from the maritime police mention clandestine landings in Necochea and Puerto Madryn. Local testimonies described boats unloading metal crates and people dressed in civilian clothing during the night. These cargoes were quickly moved to ranches belonging to Nazi sympathizers in Patagonia. The routes of the submarines to South America were carefully designed. From Europe, they made stops at ports in Galicia or Cadiz to resupply, continued to the Canary Islands, and then entered the South Atlantic, navigating at great depths to avoid detection. The journey could take between 8 and 10 weeks depending on the evasive maneuvers. Reception in Argentina was coordinated by German businessmen such as Ludwig Freude, a man with direct access to the circle of Juan Domingo Perón. Freude oversaw the transport of unloaded materials to depots on ranches near Mar del Plata, such as the aforementioned Moromar, and managed the purchase of strategic properties in Bariloche and Villa La Angostura. The German colonies in Patagonia played a key role. These communities, with transport networks and contacts within local authorities, offered lodging, logistical support and discretion. Hotels and social clubs were used as meeting centers to plan the transfer of goods and people. The Allies reacted quickly. Reports from the FB-1 and US naval intelligence detailed suspicious movements of submarines and merchant ships toward the South Atlantic. Declassified documents suggest that some U-boats carried not only resources, but also advanced military technology, such as parts for V-2 rockets and jet aircraft blueprints, destined for German engineers already established in Argentina. The voyage of the U-977 was particularly enigmatic. Heinz Schaefer, its commander, stated that they remained submerged for more than 60 days using snorkels to recharge batteries, a risky maneuver that allowed them to evade Allied patrols. Schaefer never confirmed whether there had been landings prior to their surrender in Mar del Plata, which fueled suspicions about the presence of important passengers. The arrival of these submarines in Argentina sparked global interest. The press dubbed them ghost submarines, and the theory circulated that high-ranking Nazi leaders had escaped using these routes. Although Allied investigations pressured the Argentine government, the lack of conclusive evidence allowed the matter to remain in the shadows. The Nazi networks in Argentina were already in operation before the end of the war. Import and export companies functioned as fronts to move money and resources. These companies had links with banks in Switzerland and Spain, which facilitated the flow of funds to Buenos Aires and Montevideo. Part of this money was destined for bribes and for the construction of refugees in remote areas. Ludwig Freude and his circle were key players. In addition to managing arrivals, they organized the distribution of goods and the transfer of former Nazi officers to safe areas in the interior of the country. Bariloche and Villa La Angostura became strategic points thanks to their mountainous geography and the presence of German communities with adequate infrastructure. FBI reports indicate the possibility that some submarines unloaded their cargo on deserted beaches before surrendering. This would explain the lack of valuable objects at the time of their capture. The metal crates, possibly containing gold, documents and works of art, would have been transported by truck to secret depots. Coordination with commercial routes was key. Merchant ships flying neutral flags picked up cargo in the Canary Islands or Spanish ports and carried it to Buenos Aires or Montevideo, disguised as legal merchandise. This combination of methods ensured that a significant portion of the Reich's resources reached South America without being detected. The episode of the U-boats in Argentina cemented the idea that the South Atlantic became the last Nazi escape route. The landings in Mar del Plata and other points along the Argentine coast demonstrated the effectiveness of these operations. The mix of political contacts, money and technology allowed many fugitives and strategic shipments to safely reach South America. Inalco, the final hideout. After the end of the war, Argentina became one of the most important destinations for Nazis who managed to escape. Among the areas chosen by Bormann's network, the region of Bariloche and the surroundings of Lake Nahuel Huapi were key points for setting up discreet refugees. By the middle of 1947, Hitler and Eva Braun are said to have arrived at the Inalco estate, a residence located in an area then inaccessible by land and designed to provide absolute isolation. The Inalco mansion was designed by architect Alejandro Bustillo, one of the most influential in Argentine Patagonia. The property had private docks, hangars for seaplanes, and wooded areas that blocked the view from outside. Speedboats connected it with Villa La Angostura and other strategic points on the lake. Researchers have gathered testimonies indicating that the couple moved with a small security group made up of trusted Germans, former SS officers and members of the local community. The estate was equipped with advanced technology for the time. It had electric generators, shortwave radios, and underground storage rooms with provisions and documents. Supplies arrived thanks to German businessmen from Buenos Aires and Bariloche, who organized the transport of food, medicines, and personal items. This system allowed the house's activity to go unnoticed by the authorities. During those years, Bariloche became a nerve center for the Nazis in hiding. Figures such as Josef Mengele and Erich Priebke integrated into the local community, frequenting social clubs, businesses and companies with German ties. The Club Andino Bariloche, founded before the war, was a meeting point where conversations in German were common. Hitler lived in an environment of maximum security. Visitors were selected and screened by his trusted staff. Some Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe officers who had arrived by submarine visited Inalco for confidential meetings. These gatherings dealt with financial matters, the use of hidden funds in Swiss banks, and the coordination of networks in Paraguay and Brazil, part of the structure Bormann had established before the collapse of the Reich. Eva Braun kept a low profile. Neighbors reported that she rarely left the mansion, and that when she did, she dressed simply and used false names. Some witnesses claimed she passed herself off as the wife of a German businessman. The area, with a strong German influence, favored this discretion. Hotels, breweries and bakeries run by Germans created an environment where foreigners did not arouse suspicion. Between 1947 and 1955, the Inalco estate became the operations center for the Nazi community in the south. From there, movements of money, routes for new fugitives and contacts with the Argentine government were planned. Juan Domingo Perón and Eva Duarte maintained an ambiguous relationship with these groups. In private, they provided documents and protection in exchange for technology and economic resources. The surroundings of Bariloche offered a perfect refuge. Dense forests, deep lakes and snow-covered mountains provided a natural shield. Some local residents reported armed patrols guarding the roads near Inalco. Others claimed to have seen small planes landing on the lake or boats unloading crates at the private docks, always at night. Over time, Hitler adopted a routine and isolated life. He rose early, walked through the gardens, and spoke with his security team. His health began to deteriorate in the 1950s, with cardiovascular problems and increasing tremors. Dr. Otto Lehmann, a German physician, visited him periodically and supervised treatments in secret. The Nazi community in Argentina continued to grow with the arrival of new fugitives. Many settled in nearby towns such as San Carlos de Bariloche, Villa Traful and Villa La Angostura. Some worked on infrastructure projects, while others developed hotel and tourism businesses. This flow of European immigrants made it easier for Hitler and Eva Braun's presence to go unnoticed. Inalco was not the only refuge. Other properties in Bariloche and in nearby rural areas functioned as safe houses. Several had hidden passageways and underground storage rooms with provisions and documents. These facilities were prepared to withstand inspections and to offer a quick escape route to Chile through little-used mountain passes. In 1955, after the fall of Perón, the political climate in Argentina changed. Investigations into Nazis in hiding increased, and several important figures were identified by the press. Hitler and Eva Braun then moved to more isolated properties in Patagonia. The Nazi community strengthened its networks, moving money to banks in Montevideo and Santiago. Rumors about Hitler in Argentina spread during those years. Some claimed to have seen him in downtown Bariloche, disguised with a hat and glasses. Others said they had seen him traveling by boat on Lake Nahuel Huapi with armed guards. Although no confirmed photographs remain, testimonies collected by researchers suggest that his presence was known in certain local circles. Hitler's health worsened in the late 1950s. Dr. Lehmann increased his visits, and there is talk of treatments with medicines imported from Europe. Eva Braun took on more responsibilities in managing the estate, overseeing the staff and maintaining contact with suppliers. During those years, they led a low-profile life, dedicated to rural activities and avoiding any exposure. According to the book Grey Wolf, Hitler is said to have died on the 13th of February of 1962 at the Inalco estate itself. His body was buried in an unknown location in Patagonia, possibly on the mansion's grounds. Eva Braun is believed to have remained in Argentina for some years before disappearing from the records. This theory remains controversial, though it is supported by testimonies from those who claim to have been present in his final days. The 1960s marked an increase in investigations driven by Nazi hunters. Simon Wiesenthal and others followed leads in Bariloche without finding conclusive evidence. Meanwhile, declassified FBI documents mentioned possible sightings in the region. The Inalco estate, with its private docks and limited access, was key to the Nazi leader's hidden life. Even today, it is the subject of speculation, with stories about tunnels and secret rooms. The region still bears traces of that era, from hotels founded by Germans to social clubs with roots in the 1940s. The theory of death in 1962 has been reinforced by accounts from former employees who claim to have witnessed a discreet nighttime funeral in the gardens, attended by a small group of Germans. These versions suggest that Hitler spent more than a decade hiding in Argentina, protected by a combination of isolated estates, local support, and Reich money.